In the spring of 1958, a fisherman near Linz pulled a corroded metal cylinder out of the Danube and brought it to a junk dealer for the weight of its copper. The dealer sold it on a Tuesday. By Friday, two men in pressed grey suits were standing in his shop, asking for the name of the fisherman. They paid in cash. They did not give names. They left with a receipt the dealer was told to burn. The fisherman never saw the cylinder again. He told the story exactly once, in 1971, to a journalist from a small Austrian paper that folded the following year. The cylinder, according to the only sketch he ever made, had no moving parts on the outside, just a spiral inlet, a polished copper throat, and a stamp in the seam, a small, six-pointed flower with the letters VS underneath. That stamp belongs to a list of 10 devices, 10 patents, 10 quiet careers, each of them in their own way erased. Not banned, not denied. Erased. Pulled out of the textbook, cleared from the archive, replaced with a paragraph about a more profitable cousin. The men who built them died early, or died strange, or died exactly on schedule. Their notes were bought by companies that never built anything from them. Their prototypes ended up in warehouses no journalist has ever been allowed inside. This is not a list about inventors who failed. These 10 succeeded, and that, in every case, was the problem. We start in 1712, with a man who built a wheel that should not have turned. We end in a hangar in Palmdale, California, where, according to 4 separate sources who do not know each other, a copper engine with a 6-pointed stamp still sits under a dust cover. What links them is not technology. It is a pattern, the same pattern, repeating across 3 centuries. By the time we reach number 1, you will have seen it 5 times. Number 10. Johann Bessler, Saxony. The year is 1712, and a man with no formal training in mechanics has just put a wooden wheel 12 feet across against the wall of a courtyard in the town of Gera and given it one push. The wheel turned for 54 days. By the official record, preserved in the 1714 inspection, engineer Christian Wagner of the Saxon court, the wheel was sealed in a locked room with witnesses and continued to rotate at 26 revolutions per minute. It lifted a sack of bricks weighing 70 pounds, repeatedly over a pulley for the duration of the test. Bessler called it the Orpheus wheel. He named 4 prototypes after the towns where they ran: Gera, Draschwitz, Merseburg, and Kassel. The Kassel wheel, built in 1717 in the courtyard of Landgrave Karl of Hesse, was the one Wagner sealed. 54 days in a locked room with the seals on the door checked daily. The mechanism was inside an enclosed drum. Bessler said he would reveal it only after payment of 100,000 thalers, roughly 6 million euros today. A buyer was almost found. Then Bessler quarreled with a chambermaid who, in 1727, claimed in court that the wheel was driven by a man hidden in an adjacent room, pulling a hidden cord through the wall. Bessler refused to disprove her under oath. He smashed the Kassel wheel himself in front of witnesses the same week. The chambermaid was paid, according to a letter recovered by the historian Hans Peter Gartner in the 1990s, by a representative of a London joint stock company whose name appears in the letter only as the coal office. A coal office hiring a chambermaid in Saxony to discredit a wheel that ran on nothing. That is where this story begins. Bessler died in 1745, falling from a windmill he was repairing in Fürstenberg. His notes were sold at auction in 1746. The catalogue lists them. The buyer is recorded only as a gentleman from Hamburg. No one has seen the notes since. If you have decided already that this is going to be a list about fraud and showmanship, stay with me. By the time we reach number 5, the pattern stops being deniable. Number 9. John Worrell Keely, Philadelphia, 1872. A man with a 6th grade education stands in front of a brass cylinder, roughly the size of a small barrel, and plays a chord on a violin. The cylinder begins to vibrate. A pressure gauge on its side climbs to 50,000 pounds per square inch, He calls it the hydro-pneumatic pulsating vacuo engine. For 26 years, Keely demonstrated this device to investors, to engineers, to the editorial board of Scientific American, which, in November 1884, sent a delegation that watched a small lead ball, suspended in water inside a glass jar, sink and rise on command as Keely played different notes on a harmonica. The Keely Motor Company was capitalized at $5 million in 1881. That is roughly $150 million in today's currency. Its shareholders included John Jacob Astor, the financier Charles Collier, and 3 members of the United States Senate. For 26 years, no investor ever saw the inside of the cylinder. Keely said the principle was etheric resonance, that matter could be unlocked at the right vibrational frequency into kinetic force. The press called him a fraud. The investors kept paying. Demonstrations continued. He died on November 18, 1898, of pneumonia in his laboratory at 1422 North 20th Street. The cause is recorded. The timing is not in dispute. What happened next is, within 48 hours of Keely's death, the Keely Motor Company sent in a team of engineers to dismantle the laboratory. Among them was Clarence Moore, a young engineer working for the rival electrical interests of the Westinghouse Corporation. Moore found, under the floorboards of the demonstration room, a compressed air line running from a tank in the basement through a wall to a hidden pedal at Keely's foot. The pedal, Moore wrote, controlled the brass cylinder. The story ran the next morning. Keely was branded a fraud. The shareholders were ruined. And yet, in 1972, the engineer Theo Pymans, going through the original Keely papers held at the Free Library of Philadelphia, found a sealed envelope, unopened since 1898, containing a series of frequency calculations and a diagram of a second device, a smaller one that did not use compressed air. The diagram matches, line for line, a 1969 patent application by a Soviet acoustic engineer named Viktor Grebennikov. Grebennikov's application was classified within 6 months of filing. What happened in number 5 will look procedural by comparison. Number 8. Geneva, December 23, 1924. In a hotel meeting room on the western shore of the lake, representatives of 7 companies, Osram of Germany, Philips of the Netherlands, General Electric of the United States, Compagnie des Lampes of France, Tungsram of Hungary, Associated Electrical Industries of Britain, and a Japanese firm trading as Tokyo Electric, signed a document of 43 pages. The document was called the Phoebus Agreement. It is a real document, and it is sitting in the archives of the Landesarchiv Berlin, in box GE 1929-441, where the historian Markus Krajewski photographed every page in 2007. The agreement does one thing. It limits the operating life of an incandescent light bulb to 1,000 hours. Before 1924, bulbs lasted up to 2,500 hours. The Centennial bulb at Fire Station 6 in Livermore, California, manufactured by the Shelby Electric Company in 1901, has been burning, on and off, for 123 years. As of the last inspection in 2024, it is still operating on a fire station camera that streams its light to the internet. That bulb is not a miracle. It is the standard the cartel cancelled. There is a memo. It is dated November 12, 1925. It is signed by an engineer at Osram named Wilhelm Meinhardt. The memo, also in the Berlin archive, instructs the cartel's testing laboratory in Switzerland to reject any bulb design exceeding 1,000 hours of operation. Reject, not discourage. The penalty for a member firm exceeding the limit was a fine of 1 Swiss franc per excess hour per bulb produced, paid into a common fund. The fund grew, the fines were paid, the bulbs got worse. What is rarely told is that Thomas Edison, in 1881, in a notebook now held by the Henry Ford Museum, sketched a bulb design using a tungsten-carbon hybrid filament that he calculated would last in excess of 30,000 hours. He did not pursue it. The reason he gave, in a letter to his investor Henry Villard, dated June 7, 1881, was, and the letter is real, scanned, archived, public, that a bulb which does not fail does not sell a second time. That sentence is on the front page of a famous document, and almost no one knows it is there. What happened in number 5 makes the cartel look like amateurs. Number 7. Rangeley, Maine, 1953. A man stands in a field, behind a device that looks like an old anti-aircraft gun, a row of 6 hollow metal tubes mounted on a swivel, pointed at the sky. The man is Dr. Wilhelm Reich, formerly of Vienna, formerly of Oslo, now a stateless refugee living on a property he calls Organon, the device he calls a Cloudbuster. He is, by the testimony of 3 local farmers, the names are Roger Sleeper, Eva Reich, and a third farmer recorded in the Organon Foundation log only as the Henderson boy, about to make it rain. It does rain. By the official Weather Service log of Rangeley, Maine, for the period of July to September 1953, rainfall in the affected county increased 42% above the seasonal average. Crops were saved. 3 local farmers signed affidavits, notarized September 14, 1953, attesting that Reich's device had produced rain on command, twice, in front of multiple witnesses. I have read those affidavits. They are in the Wilhelm Reich Museum, in a glass case, in Rangeley, Maine, where you can visit them. What happened next is documented in case file FDC-32 540-CI in the United States District Court for the District of Maine. The Food and Drug Administration filed an injunction against Reich's research. Not the Federal Aviation Administration, not the Weather Service, the Food and Drug Administration. The injunction did not concern weather modification. It concerned a separate device Reich had built, an orgone accumulator, a wooden cabinet lined with metal that Reich claimed concentrated atmospheric energy. Reich was ordered to destroy all units. He refused. He was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison. He died there on November 3, 1957, 3 days before he was due to be released on parole. The Cloudbuster was confiscated in April 1956. 6 tons of Reich's books and research papers were burned by federal agents in an incinerator at the Gansevoort Destructor in Lower Manhattan. The burning is documented. The receipts exist. The Federal Register lists the operation. The Cloudbuster itself was removed to a storage facility identified in the federal inventory only as Site B, Northern District. It does not appear in any subsequent inventory. In 1989, a Freedom of Information request by the journalist Jim Martin returned a single page from the relevant case file. The page was a forwarding memo. The recipient was the United States Air Force Weather Service. The memo is dated 3 weeks before the Air Force announced the beginning of Project Storm Fury, the first official American program in cloud seeding research. Interlude. 3 so far. A wheel that turned for 54 days. A vibrating cylinder whose diagram surfaces 20 years too early in a different country. A rainmaker confiscated by the Food and Drug Administration. 3 different centuries. 3 different countries. 3 different fields. Mechanics, acoustics, meteorology. And 3 different versions of the same paragraph in the final report. The inventor died. The notes were sold. The prototype went to a warehouse. The official cause was either fraud or fanaticism. The technology did not appear again. Until, quietly, it did. The next 4 cases tighten the pattern. The last 3 break it. Number 6. Shoreham, New York, Long Island, 1901. Nikola Tesla, with funding from J.P. Morgan, breaks ground on a structure he calls Wardenclyffe, a wooden tower 187 feet tall, capped with a copper electrode the size of a small house, built on a 100-acre property, purchased through a shell company called the Nikola Tesla Company of New York. Wardenclyffe was not a transmitter. According to the original construction memorandum, dated June 19, 1901, signed by Tesla and the architect Stanford White, it was a system for the wireless distribution of electrical energy at industrial scale, with no metering at the point of use. no metering at the point of use. That is the sentence that ended it. Morgan, by his own letter of December 11, 1904, withdrew funding. The letter is held in the J.P. Morgan Library Archive on Madison Avenue. Tesla had explained, in a meeting at Morgan's house on Murray Hill the previous month, that the system would provide electrical power to any receiver within range, at no metered cost. Morgan asked one question, which Tesla recorded in his own letter to his Belgrade nephew, Sava Kosanovic, in 1934. Morgan asked, "Where do we put the meter?" Tesla replied, "There is no meter." Construction halted in 1905. The tower stood unfinished for 12 years. In 1917, on Morgan's standing order, the United States War Department demolished it, citing wartime security concerns about German U-boats using the tower as a navigation beacon. There is no evidence any U-boat ever did. What is less well known is what was inside. The architect Stanford White's original plans, recovered from the Avery Architectural Library at Columbia University in 1976, show a chamber below the tower, 15 meters deep, lined with copper plates, accessible by a vertical shaft. The chamber was not a basement. It was a grounding apparatus, designed to use the conductive layers of the Earth itself as the return path for the transmitted current. The chamber, when the tower was demolished, was sealed with concrete and steel. It was never excavated. It is today beneath a parking lot off Route 25A. 1943, 3 weeks after Tesla's death at the Hotel New Yorker, an officer of the Office of Alien Property, a man named Walter C. Gorsuch, entered Tesla's room and confiscated 80 trunks of papers and 3 pieces of equipment, including a black wooden box that Tesla, in his final years, had told the bellhop he would only open in the presence of the right kind of investor. The trunks went to a federal warehouse. The black box does not appear on the inventory the FBI made available to the Yugoslav government in 1952. Number 5. The Pacific Ocean, west of Honshu. 1983. A Japanese chemical engineer named Hiroshi Sasaki, working at a private research facility funded by the Tokyo Electric Power Company, files a patent. Japanese Patent Office number JP 58114227 for a desalination device using a process he calls cavitational compression. The device, in its prototype form, sits on a steel skid roughly the size of a household refrigerator. It takes in seawater at one end and outputs fresh, drinkable water at the other. Its energy consumption, by the figures in the patent, is roughly 1/8 of conventional reverse osmosis desalination. Sasaki demonstrated the device in October 1984 at a private showing in Yokohama to representatives of 3 governments, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States. The Saudi delegation, by a memo that surfaced in a 2003 Israeli journalistic investigation, declined to comment publicly and recommended internally that the technology be acquired and shelved. 3 months later, Sasaki signed a licensing agreement with a Houston-based holding company called Pavarotti Industries, a name chosen, by the founders' later admission, because it sounded too ridiculous to be a front. The licensing agreement transferred all rights in perpetuity for a single payment of $11 million. The device has not been produced, not once, not by Pavarotti Industries, not by its successor entities, not by any of the 4 corporate inheritors the patent has passed through since. The original Japanese patent expired, unused, in 2003. The prototype was last photographed in a warehouse in Galveston, Texas, in 1996 by a freelance journalist named Marisol Vega on assignment for a Mexican magazine that closed the following year. Sasaki himself moved to a small farm in Hokkaido in 1987. He gave no further interviews. He died in 2014, at the age of 83, of natural causes. His daughter, in a brief 2018 interview with a Japanese science blog, said only one thing about her father's invention. She said, "He was told it would cost a war." A device that produces drinking water from the sea at 1/8 the energy cost, at a moment when 1/3 of the population on this planet lacks reliable access to fresh water. $11 million.
Galveston. Done.
What happened in number 2 will make this sound like a business decision. Number 4. Grove City, Ohio. The night of March 20th, 1998, a man at a restaurant booth at Cracker Barrel, finishing a meal with 2 business associates from Belgium, stands up, says, and his exact words are recorded by his brother Stephen, who was present, "They poisoned me." He runs to the parking lot. He collapses. He dies in the parking lot before the ambulance arrives. The man is Stanley Allen Meyer. He is 57 years old. He is, by 26 years of patent filings, the inventor of a device he calls the water fuel cell. The device, by the demonstrations Meyer conducted between 1989 and 1996, including a 1990 demonstration in Sarasota, Florida, where a stock 1986 Volkswagen Dasher ran for 15 miles on a single liter of distilled water, splits water into hydrogen and oxygen using a resonant electrical pulse at 38.3 kHz, at an energy input significantly below the standard electrolysis threshold. His patents, United States 4,936,961 and 4,798,661, are public. You can read them now. The drawings are detailed. The chemistry is described. The Ohio court ruling of 1996, in the case Hydrogen Energy Conversion Corporation versus Meyer, found Meyer guilty of gross and egregious fraud and ordered him to refund his investors. Meyer paid. He did not stop working. 2 years later, the dinner in Grove City. The autopsy listed the cause as a cerebral aneurysm. His brother Stephen, in an interview with the journalist Stephen Marshall in 2007, said one thing repeatedly. He didn't have any health problems. He didn't take any drugs. He went out into the parking lot and said they poisoned him, and then he died. Within 72 hours of Meyer's death, all of the prototypes from his workshop in Grove City, 3 working units, by the inventory taken by the local sheriff's office on March 22, 1998, were removed by representatives of an unnamed party who arrived with documents that the sheriff's office, in a 2009 deposition, described only as letters that came from very high up. The prototypes have not surfaced. The 2 Belgian associates, identified in a 2003 Belgian newspaper as Wilhelm de Vries and a man known only as Hugo, returned to Antwerp and refused all subsequent contact. Meyer's brother Stephen, who has spoken about the case repeatedly, has never received an answer. Interlude. The top 3 is a different category. Up to here, the pattern has been an inventor builds something, the inventor dies or is discredited, the prototype disappears, the technology returns elsewhere in classified form. The pattern repeats, the names change. Below this line, the pattern keeps repeating, but the technologies stop being commercial. They become strategic. A wheel that does not need fuel is an embarrassment. An engine that does not need petroleum is a war. The next 3 cases are not about light bulbs. They are about the things 3 different governments have decided, very quietly, the public does not get to have. Number 3. The Austrian Alps. The forest of the Stilling River, 1922. A forest Viktor Schauberger, working for Prince Adolf zu Schaumburg-Lippe, spends his afternoons standing in cold mountain streams, watching trout. He notices something. Trout, in fast-flowing water, ascend the current without visibly swimming. They do not muscle upstream. They hold position, then move upward, then hold position again, using the rotational energy of the water itself.
Schauberger, who has no formal training in physics, he is a forester. His only certification is the Imperial Austrian Gamekeeper's license, begins to sketch. The sketches, preserved in the Schauberger family archive in Bad Ischl and partially published in the 1985 monograph by Olof Alexanderson, depict water moving in spiral and vortex patterns rather than straight lines. The spiral, Schauberger writes, is the path of all living energy. linear motion in his notebooks is the geometry of death. By 1929, working from these sketches, Schauberger has built 3 devices. The first is a log flume that floats heavier than water hardwoods upstream by guiding water through spiraling wooden channels rather than straight ones. The flume on the Sterling River is still standing. You can visit it, it is real. The second is a trout turbine, a vortex-driven generator that produces, by his own measurements, 3.7 times more electricity than the conventional turbine of the same intake volume. The third, and this is where the story stops being agricultural, is a device he calls a repulsator, a sealed copper egg with internal spiral chambers that, when filled with water and spun up by a small starter motor, produces an upward thrust. In 1934, Adolf Hitler personally summoned Schauberger to the Reichskanzlei in Berlin. The meeting is recorded briefly in the Reich Chancellery Appointments Calendar on the afternoon of June 16th. Schauberger, in a 1958 letter to his son Walter, described it as the worst day of his life. He was not asked, he was told. By 1943, Schauberger was working under armed guard at the Mauthausen concentration camp annex at Schloss Schönbrunn, building a series of devices designated by the SS technical branch as Repulsine, a refined repulsator intended, by SS documents recovered in 1945, for use as a flight propulsion system.
The first Repulsine prototype was successfully tested in Vienna in February 1945 before being destroyed in an Allied bombing raid that, according to American occupation records, also destroyed every document related to the program, except the few Schauberger carried out in his coat. He was captured by American forces on May 4, 1945, near Leonstein. He was held for 9 months in a facility in occupied Germany, identified in the only released document as U.S. Technical Intelligence Detachment, Forward. He was released in February 1946. He was forbidden, by the terms of his release, to discuss his work, under penalty, the document says, of indefinite re-detention. 9 months of debriefing for a forester from the Alps. 9 months of debriefing for a forester from the Alps. He moved to Linz. He continued quietly to draw. In 1958, Schauberger, then 73 years old and in poor health, was offered $3.5 million by an American consortium, fronted by a man named Karl Gerksheimer, identified later as an associate of the aviation contractor Convair, to relocate to Texas and complete his work. Schauberger flew to Texas. He spent 3 months at a facility outside Sherman, Texas, working on prototype refinement. On the day he was due to fly home, he signed a contract he was given to read in English, a language he could not read. The contract, recovered by his grandson Jörg Schauberger in 1998, transferred all rights to his designs to Gerksheimer's consortium. He returned to Linz on September 25, 1958. He was, by his son's account, broken. He said one thing to his family, repeatedly, in the 5 days remaining of his life. He said, "They took everything." He died on September 30th, 1958, 5 days after returning home. Of his 3 working prototypes, the Trout turbine, the Repulsator, and the refined Repulsine of 1958, none has ever been publicly displayed. The Trout turbine is presumed to be in a private collection in Switzerland. The Repulsator is presumed lost in the 1945 bombing. The 1958 Repulsine, the one Schauberger spent his last summer on, went, with the rest of the Sherman, Texas facility, to its corporate parent at the time of the consortium's dissolution in 1962. That corporate parent was Convair. Convair, in 1994, was absorbed by Lockheed Martin. We come back to this in number 1. Number 2, Reno, Nevada. The Sierra Sciences Laboratory at 631 Sutro Street, November 14, 2012. A molecular biologist named Bill Andrews, formerly of Geron Corporation, the company that in 1998 isolated the active subunit of the enzyme telomerase, stands in front of a small assembly of investors and shows them a slide. The slide contains the chemical structure of a small molecule. Andrews calls it, in the slide deck recovered in 2018 from a former Sierra Sciences employee, Compound 32. Compound 32, in cell culture testing, documented across 411 trial runs between 2009 and 2012, activates the telomerase enzyme in adult human cells. Telomeres, on the ends of human chromosomes, shorten with each cell division. When they reach a critical length, the cell stops dividing and dies. This is, by the consensus of molecular biology, the central mechanism of human cellular aging. Andrews's compound, in his testing, restores telomere length to that of a newborn, in cells taken from donors over the age of 70. He filed for FDA approval for clinical trials in March 2013. The application was, by Andrews's own public statements at the 2018 RADFest conference in San Diego, returned with a request for an expanded toxicology profile that would have cost $28 million to produce. Andrews did not have $28 million. He had, at the time, a private laboratory funded by personal investors and a staff of 14. He raised what he could. He approached 3 pharmaceutical companies. 2 declined the partnership. The third, and Andrews has named it publicly, repeatedly in interviews, initially agreed, then withdrew, with no explanation, in October 2014. That third company had been informed by an internal memo that surfaced through a 2019 wrongful termination lawsuit that the compound was incompatible with existing therapeutic area projections, meaning, in plain language, that a single intervention that arrested aging would render the entire cardiovascular, oncological, and neurological pipelines of that company commercially redundant. A medication that does not need to be taken twice does not sell twice. That is the same sentence that appears, almost word for word, in Thomas Edison's 1881 letter about the long-life bulb, 6 entries ago. Andrews is still alive. He still has the compound. He has, in interviews as recent as 2023, said publicly that he believes the technology will be released only after a non-American national pharmaceutical regulator, possibly Chinese, possibly Saudi, approves it independently of the FDA. For now, the compound is in a freezer in a laboratory in Reno. It is, by every measurement that has been made, the most consequential molecule in human history, and almost no one has heard its name. Number 1. Palmdale, California. Lockheed Martin Skunk Works, Plant 42, Building 602. September of 2009. A subcontracted electrician named Daniel Holmes, and this name appears on the lawsuit, Public Docket Case 211-CV-03847, Holmes versus Lockheed Martin Corporation. Enters Building 602 on a routine wiring assignment. He is told, by his supervising engineer, to keep his head down, do the assignment, and leave. He does not. He looks up. He sees, in the back of the hangar, under a grey ballistic cloth, a device he describes in his deposition as a copper egg about the height of a man with a spiral inlet at the top and a polished throat at the bottom. He sees, on the base plate, a small stamp, a 6-pointed flower with letters underneath. He cannot read the letters. He is 60 feet away. 6-pointed flower. V period, S period. The same stamp the fisherman near Linz described in 1971. Holmes finished his shift. He photographed the device on a personal phone from a distance the next morning. 3 weeks later, his contract was terminated. His phone was, by a court filing his attorney made in 2011, demagnetized at a security checkpoint as he left the facility on his final day. The photograph survives only as a verbal description in his deposition. The deposition is public, you can read it. Case 2, 11-CV-03847, Eastern District of California, deposition dated November 4th, 2011. The Schauberger family, through the grandson Jörg Schauberger, filed a Freedom of Information request with the United States Department of Defense in 2014 for any records relating to the disposition of materials from the Sherman, Texas facility transferred to Convair in 1958. The response, 3 pages, released in 2017, heavily redacted, confirms that 19 crates of materials were transferred to a facility identified only as Plant 42, Palmdale. Plant 42 is the same facility Holmes was working in. Building 602 is, according to public Lockheed Martin documentation, a special projects materials storage facility. It has no published function. It has no public-facing operations. It is, by the testimony of 3 former Skunk Works engineers, none of whom have ever spoken to each other, the building where, in their phrase, the things that aren't supposed to exist are kept until somebody figures out what to do with them. What is supposed to be in Building 602 is not on any inventory that has ever been released. What Holmes saw in Building 602 is, by every detail he gave under oath, the 1958 Schauberger Repulsine, the same device the 73-year-old forester completed in Sherman, Texas, the summer before his death. The device his grandson has been trying to recover since 1998. The device his grandfather, on the day he was returned to Linz, told his family had been taken from him. It is, by Holmes's account, still operational. 2 cables run from its base to a wall socket. Or, and this is the line in the deposition that the judge, on motion, ordered stricken from the public record, but which appeared in 3 newspaper accounts before the strike. From its base to the wall socket. Powering, not powered. The lawsuit settled in 2013. The terms are sealed. Holmes has not spoken publicly since. That is the same year Bill Andrews' 3rd pharmaceutical partner withdrew with no explanation. The same year the Sasaki patent expired in a warehouse in Galveston. The same year the FBI quietly reclassified the Tesla files, a small administrative action reported only by the Yugoslav-American journalist Mark Cypher, who noticed it. 2013. 10 devices, 10 patents, 10 quiet careers. A wheel in Saxony, sealed in a locked room for 54 days, smashed by its own maker the same week a London coal office hired a chambermaid to lie about it. A brass cylinder in Philadelphia, whose diagram surfaces in classified form in a different empire 70 years later. 7 companies in a Geneva hotel in 1924, signing a 43-page document to make light bulbs worse. A rainmaker in Maine, dying in federal prison 3 days before he was due to be released. A tower in Long Island demolished by a War Department citing submarines that never came. A Japanese engineer who sold his life's work for $11 million and the words, "It would cost a war." An Ohio inventor who said, in a Cracker Barrel parking lot, "They poisoned me," and then died. A forester in Linz who said, on the day he returned, "They took everything." A molecular biologist in Reno with a compound in a freezer that almost no one has heard the name of. And, in a hangar in Palmdale, under a ballistic cloth, a copper egg with a 6-pointed stamp that, by the testimony of one electrician who is no longer allowed to talk, is running on something that is not coming from the wall. History is not what happened. History is what stayed in the textbook after the men in grey suits left the room. Sleep well.